Okay, let's start the lecture. What do you say here? Hey, I want to start by beginning with the end in mind because I want you to keep the goal of youth ministry in mind as we approach each lecture in the class, and that's this. It's the adoption of adolescents into the body of Christ. What we want to be about is creating, as you can see here, kind of a funnel where youth ministry nurtures and ushers young people into the larger body there, so they become full participants, full heirs in the kingdom way of life. Historically, youth ministry really has been more of a programmatic entity that's not typically designed to do that. It may be happening in some ways. Maybe it's happening where you are, and that's great. But I would say by and large, there's a lot of support for youth ministry at a church, but the idea that the church itself should be the receiving body that adopts adolescents into the full life of the church is not always embraced by everybody. So that's our goal. And the reason that I tell you that is because what we're going to talk about today is going to help make the case for our goal. I'll start with a story. A number of years ago, when I was a part-time staff person at a church working in youth ministry, and I was also a volunteer with Young Life, I'd go to this restaurant where a number of youth ministry people would meet for breakfast almost any day of the week because it was centered right around several high schools. A lot of kids would stop in for food before they go to school. And so this one particular day, I ran into Katie. And Katie was involved in our youth group at church. She was also involved with Young Life. I knew Katie well. I knew her family well. So it was no surprise to see her and spend some time with her there eating. But she was telling me this particular day about a really stressful situation she was going to have to face at school. She had to deal with some kind of uncomfortable confrontation with someone. I can't even remember now what it was about, but I just remember her saying, I'm just so stressed out. I don't know what to do. I'm so stressed out. And so me wanting to be the helpful sort of, on the spot youth worker with always the right thing to say at the right time, I just said, Katie, just be yourself. To which Katie fired back to me, but I don't know who that is. And I've always remembered that conversation with Katie. It was very formative for me. It illustrates probably what you already know and observe in kids, that at some level they're trying to answer the developmental question, who am I? So it's not a novel idea in youth ministry. But what's unique about this is the fact that the task of being yourself, with emphasis on self, has become increasingly more difficult throughout all of history. I would really say in recent history, it's just become more and more challenging. So we want to take some time to understand why, so that we can ask ourselves this really significant question. What can we as ministers to adolescents do in order to help them and guide them in this journey of becoming who they are, of being themselves? I would suggest this is really a foundational aspect of ministry to adolescents for us if we're really going to take seriously the end goal of adolescents being adopted into the body of Christ. It's my conviction that in ministry today, just like it was back in that day with Katie, that we really, not intentionally, but unintentionally, we might underestimate the burden of becoming a self. I think we also miss a significant opportunity in ministry to really share in the forming of an adolescent identity that's both integrated, it's whole, and it's centered on Jesus. And that takes a lot of intentionality, a lot of thoughtfulness to do that. So why is becoming a self, or what is becoming a self, and why is it so hard to be one? Well, that really was probably at the heart of my conversation with Katie, because I knew enough to know that the stage of life we call adolescence was getting longer and that it was tougher to navigate. That wasn't new to me. And I think both Katie and I knew it was hard to transition from being a child into being an adult. She was certainly feeling that in 11th grade. But I don't think either of us really understood just how burdensome the task of being yourself had really become. Really in Western culture, and I'll speak primarily about Western culture here, the last 350 years or so, there really hasn't been a concept that's more important for understanding what it means to be a human person than that concept of the self. But the idea of the self and the task of becoming a self, it really is commonplace for us. We just accept it as a normative part of life today, but that's not always been the case. But rarely do we go back looking deeper into the origin or the historical understanding of the self. We rarely question that. We just thought this is just the way it's always been. But as contemporary philosopher Charles Taylor says, and he says this in a really deep sort of way, basically he says there just hasn't been a time in history where there was really as he says, the noun, the self, preceded by a definite article like the self or a self. We had a vague idea of self-reference. We were aware of individuality, but not to the extent that we think of being a highly individualistic self. That's a relatively new thing. So what's that mean? Does it that people in the past really only understood themselves relative to a larger culture, or it was just about their ethnicity or their religion they were part of? Well, that's not exactly true, because that really doesn't seem to jibe with us or make sense for those of us in the West who tend to think really individualistically. We've grown up with a notion, haven't we, that you can be anything you want to be. We were told that since the time we had diapers on our bodies, probably. So this is, pretty typical for us, and it may kind of run counter to what we would assume being a self really is, because we tend to kind of push back against traditions or norms that start to impinge on our ability to choose for ourselves who we are, right? Well, that's not the way it's always been, but I don't want you to think that that this historic understanding of who we are is without respect for individuals. It just existed in a different sort of way. So let's go back in history. I'll try to do this clearly but briefly to walk through time so you can see how the idea of the self has been formed. Okay, so we'll go back to Israel's history, where predominantly people existed in a tribe or a clan or a people group, right? So the individual was deeply embedded there in Israel's day. But I try to do this with the PowerPoint to go, color-wise, it's kind of homogeneous. So this is sort of like in Israel's time right here. Whereas, our modern idea was really to be a true self, you kind of had to peel away all the layers of social ties and any other kind of cultural demands to get to the real, unique, individual core self. That was not really how it was understood in times like in in that Old Testament era. In cultures like that, they knew nothing of a self as an essentially independent, isolated unit, but rather, really, individuals were seen as overlapping members of one another. All right, let's move on then to Jesus' day. We still have the tribe, the clan, the people, and the individual self resides there. But in Jesus' day, and kind of our New Testament period, things began to change. There were a lot more influences. There was, as a result, the surrounding tribe, clan, and people began to maybe be a little less solid or a little less substantial than it used to be. What were those influences? Well, there was oppression. Israel was occupied by Rome. So people began to see themselves in light of occupation. There was also the influences of the Greek culture that had surrounded them. So Hellenistic influences were beginning to creep in some ways. And in general, there was just a growing pluralism that was creeping in, and so the absolute effect of the tribe or the clan or the people was beginning to erode just a little bit. It didn't mean that people were isolated individuals by any stretch, but they were really surrounded by a less influential tribe, clan, and people. Then we move into the time of Augustine, which would have been the medieval area, and this is really begin to see the emergence of the self here. Augustine is really credited with the emergence of the concept of this inner autonomous self here. He's really influential in later Western thought, but he really begins it. Shortly after Augustine, the 6th century philosopher Boethius defined a person as an individual substance of rational nature. This was a radically new way of seeing people. I just quoted a 6th century philosopher named Boetius to you. Don't get freaked out about this. I'm not trying to overwhelm you with obscure thoughts about the self. I just want you to kind of see this progression here. Here's what's happening. The idea of the self begins to emerge, where persons are beginning to be viewed as free subjects who act on their own volition to establish relationships with others. Now, relationships prior to this time had been absolutely essential to speaking identity into people. They weren't chosen freely. They were your surrounding, and they were fundamental in that regard. Now relationships are still valuable, but they're valuable for things like growth and maturity, but not fundamentally for identity as they used to be. So the key ideas that are emerging here are self-chosen relationships. An authentic self is the inner self. These are things we take for granted, right? But they didn't really exist prior to this time. So this trend continues as more and more influences begin to emerge. So as we move into the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance period, what we see is the self now is becoming a little clearer in contrast to what surrounds the self. And we see a number of new influences that have the effect of making that surrounding a little more granular. So other institutions that begin to rise in this Middle Age period or during the Renaissance, they began to have a claim on the identity of people, and new narratives began to come in to have a shape on individuals. So we can see that in economic institutions where we're moving from more that local communal mercantilism to more individualistic capitalism. So individualistic is the key word there. You see that? We're moving from small fiefdoms that begin to merge together and consolidate it into more powerful and influential nation states, and these have new narratives about what it means to be a part of these new people groups. So that begins to inform how people see themselves. We move from an illiterate society now to a more literate population. Not inconsequentially or insignificantly, the fact that people now are also given Bibles to read, or they'll be able to read Bibles for themselves. The idea, of course, at the time was, well, if you put the Bible in the hands of the people and not just in the hands of the elites, the priests, they'll read it and they'll come to the same conclusion for themselves. Because, come on, hey, it's the Bible, right? And we know from history that certainly wasn't the case. That actually it led to a lot of fragmentation because people didn't all come to the same conclusions. Before this, Rome had been the central power and where all of Christian life had been directed. But now in the Reformation, Rome's influence as this monolithic institution begins to erode, and people begin to think of themselves in new ways in light of the Reformation. And then we're starting to move now from traditional into more societal commitments, and that has an effect on who we are as individuals. Now we're going to move into the Enlightenment period. We got that granular surrounding there. The individual, by contrast, is in the midst of that, and we're seeing the emergence of the modern industrial West here. Okay, so what happens during this time? Well, we move from a period of time where science begins to grow in its influence in the place of religion, and the notion that maybe the world actually works without a God begins to emerge as science begins to make new discoveries and come up with new explanations. This leads to what I would call Enlightenment exuberance. There was just all this excitement that was emerging now as scientists began to discover how the body worked, how the world worked, how physics and astronomy and so many other aspects of the world, the universe worked. The notion that at some point we were on a trajectory towards discovering all the ways that the world and the universe worked, and that we'd be able to solve all the challenges or problems that faced us. And so as a result, human beings were moving into the center of that universe. And that was the place that previously only God had occupied. So God begins to move out of the center. The individual is now really seen as the one who holds the most influence for figuring out how things ought to be. Also, at the same time, this wasn't just a movement of the scientific elites or the Enlightenment. We see the Great Awakening occur, and this is the first Great Awakening, and this was the first time on a large scale that people were having individual religious experiences apart from the church, which had been the primary religious influencer, that institution at the time. So things like personal piety and personal religion begin to emerge here. You see the movements of like the Puritans who were trying to escape what they saw the corruption of the institutionalized church as well. And so again, high emphasis on personal individualistic piety that had not really existed to this extent before. So again, there's a big influence there. We see things like later in this modern period, the rise of modern psychology, and particularly in the late 19th century, the concept of adolescence shows up. But this really is where psychology begins to delve deeper into what an individual is, and probing the inner workings of the self. This is really kind of pondered now, and so now we really see the self as preeminent. And then, whereas before the norms were moving from traditional to societal, now they're moving from societal to individual. So what happens is this surrounding that had supported the individual begins to fade away, and so now what we're left with, as you can see, is the individual self all alone. So when we come back to adolescence, again, just in my conversation with Katie, and as you probably know, one of the fundamental driving questions they have is, who am I? But now, where that question is preeminent, the self must be discovered alone. So what used to be a cultural, societal, communal responsibility and way of life now falls almost entirely on the shoulders of an adolescent who's transitioning from childhood into adulthood. They essentially have to figure that out all by themselves. When you read, or if you've already read Hurt 2.0, the chapters in Hurt 2.0, this will become abundantly clear. Chap Clark calls this systemic abandonment. It's a key term or concept that we'll refer to throughout the class. But that's really where we are now. And that is a cataclysmic shift from what it meant to be a person centuries and centuries ago. It's never been like this before. So we would exist in a world today where it might be fair to say that adolescents are offered unrestricted meaning making. And if you're an adolescent, that might sound like the greatest thing ever, until we're faced with the reality that they live in a world of constant change with an endless array of choices, and essentially no one with the credibility to be able to walk with them and say, this is the choice for you and this isn't the choice for you. In fact, it's almost unheard of that, or even considered beneficial to do that now. So all the burden of responsibility falls on the shoulders of adolescents. That is significant about where we are here. So again, when I say, Katie, be yourself, she fired back, but I don't know who that is. A clear indicator of the challenges of being a self today. So psychologist Jean Twenge says, in our contemporary society, multiple institutions in our culture have taught adolescents their entire lives to put their own needs first and to focus on feeling good about themselves. That's not an indictment or a criticism of adolescents. It's what they've had to do in order to navigate this challenge of being a self all by themselves. Then with regard to religion, Christian Smith in Soul Searching says they are moralistic therapeutic deists. They believe vaguely in a God who's out there and far away. He doesn't have a lot of relevance for day-to-day life, but essentially he wants people to be good and he wants them to be happy. I mean, that is a self-focused form of religion. It's therapeutic. It's what it does for me to make me feel better. And then Kenda Creasy Dean from Princeton says, but they're almost Christian. Who they are, who they live out their lives as Christians, doesn't reflect the historic Orthodox Christian faith. That's the reality of where we are there in this challenge of being a self. So what about youth ministry? How has youth ministry intersected this challenge of being a self? I won't go into great detail about this because if you haven't yet, you will read this week the document that I have written for you called A Brief History of Youth Ministry. But I'll just say this, that youth ministry has existed, in my opinion, in three main phases. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this, but I'll just say it this way for you. The missiological phase, kind of where youth ministry really comes on the scene in its very early form. In that middle time, sort of a nurture educational emphasis in ministry. And then lastly, the fellowship neo-missional. Won't say too much here, just a couple things. Missiological phase influenced by the Second Great Awakening, that revivalist mentality. Horace Bushnell pushed back against that somewhat. He really believed that could be manipulative and over-emotional. Therefore, he felt like we ought to emphasize nurture, that young people ought to grow up never having not known themselves as Christians. But there were people like Dwight L. Moody who represented a different view, and that was essentially that little people, young people, are little adults, he would say. So adolescence, he would have viewed as young adults, little adults that needed to be converted. That was that missiological evangelistic emphasis at that time as youth ministry begins to emerge. That shifts late 1800s, early 1900s, emphasized by the impact of the Christian Endeavor movement and Christian Endeavor Society, which was highly focused on Christian nurture and was then later much more focused on education. If we know the right things, if we know the right stuff, then we'll be the right people. But then emerging out of World War II, youth ministry began to make a big shift. There was the rise of what we call the teenager. That's where that term emerged in popular culture. It was the rise of the parachurch and professional youth ministry. All of these aspects were brand new. These are what we really know the most about youth ministry today, but these are relatively new on the scene. Excuse me. I would say this, just last little comment about youth ministry, is that essentially youth ministry, at least in this phase and kind of where we are right now, it was trickle-down youth ministry. The idea really was if we reach the middle class, primarily the suburbanites at that time, or those who are leaders, those with social capital who would end up being the shapers of the future, then we'd be able to influence the entire culture for Christ. And that would benefit everybody that we're not reaching right now. So because they'd be engaged politically, in business, in government, in civic organizations. And so Christian influence would permeate all aspects of Western life. So they would emphasize and kind of shrink down the gospel message into what you might consider the essentials, like the 4 spiritual laws or the Roman road. But that lacked a connection to a larger narrative of God at work. And so you might think we kind of discarded or jettisoned some essential understanding of what it meant to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus or being the people of God. And I don't want to undermine this idea of the 4 spiritual laws. It was true that Jesus died for our sins, but that was very individualistic, and that kind of fit with where people were at the time. But it really assumed that there was this surrounding environment that was going to take care of the rest. There would be kind of a stream of growth or discipleship that people could kind of step into, kind of culturally, in a general sense, because culture and society and values were essentially Judeo-Christian, but also there was an easy transition. Easy might not be the right word, but there was an acceptable transition into church life from that point. Now, I'm not convinced that youth ministry has entered into a significantly new phase. I know that the word missional shows up a lot as kind of a buzzword in ministry in a lot of places. It may be different where you are, but by and large, youth ministry still relies on kind of a segmented approach. Youth are kind of off in their own space somewhere else. And it's an attractional strategy, trying to be big enough to draw people into that segmented space. And the idea of fellowship strategy for those within still exists too. And if you haven't read that in the brief history of ministry to adolescence, you will. So that'll make more sense. But I tell you all this because I want you to to be aware of this idea. That throughout history, what sociologist Peter Berger has said, starting in the 1960s, he said that throughout history, if there was a belief in the sacred, it really came because there were a coherence and a synergy of a number of things that would produce a sacred canopy that would sustain religious belief in particular. So religious belief had to have what he called plausibility structures. It was plausible to believe in, to put our trust in a particular religion, if that religion were supported and nurtured and cared for and protected by this sacred canopy. So cultural values had to line up. The family as an institution had to be protected. It was a primary place of this kind of nurture and protection. Religious institutions needed to be strong. They needed to have influence in the larger culture. They needed to be the place that people would turn to for guidance. There needed to be a sense of the sacred, so participation in religious life was seen to be something that benefited everybody, and the idea that belief or faith and science could coexist, that faith and science weren't mutually exclusive or polar opposites like they are now. These are just a few suggestions of what might exist in a sacred canopy that would really sustain belief. Well, you probably know these things have dissolved or faded from public life in the West now, so the sacred canopy has essentially dissolved or faded away, and as a result that's made religious belief, increasingly difficult. Added to that, it'd be fair to say that Christianity is not our primary language in the West anymore. It is really essentially a foreign language, and that's very significant. It's just not the language that we speak, and the people that we encounter in day-to-day life have no real understanding whatsoever. Even we have generations and generations of people who have zero exposure to Christianity. Mary Eberstadt, who is a cultural critic, wrote a book in 2015 called How the West Was Really Lost, and she says that religion is really like a language. It's not just a nice little cartoon graphic there, but she says religion really is like a language. You can only learn it in community, starting with the community of the family. And when both the family and the community become fragmented and fall, the transmission of religion to the next generation becomes far more difficult. So again, if you think about the emphasis on the individual and the challenge of becoming the self, the necessity of figuring out on your own how to become the self, makes sense then that your exposure to and your integration into religious belief would also fade, because we don't have that transmission of the language of belief anymore, because we don't have integrated community support that surrounds the individual, and we have fragmented families as well too, right? And not only that, the landscape of ministry has changed. So we might be able to kind of see where ministry existed in the past, where kids were in what we call one of four quadrants. So we have our little scale there. We'd have on one end a high level of understanding about Christianity, and the bottom they would have no understanding of Christianity. To the left we would have high enthusiasm about Christianity, and to the right we'd have low enthusiasm, they'd be disinterested in Christianity. So if we give these quadrants, quadrant 1 would be high enthusiasm and high understanding. Those would be Christian kids. Quadrant 2 would be high understanding but just not very interested. So those would be bored kids. Quadrant 3 would be enthusiasm, just no understanding. So those would be your interested or seeker kids. And then quadrant 4 would be no understanding, disinterested, and those would be just kids who are closed in general to Christianity. So when this current phase of youth ministry, this fellowship, neo-missional phase of youth ministry beginning in the 1940s really began to emerge, I think we could say that in general we were targeting Christian kids and bored kids. But because there was a high level of understanding, there was still the basic understanding of Christianity still permeated so many aspects of normal life in the West. But what's happened in our day now, whereas there was high understanding before, and things have really shifted in contemporary youth ministry, it goes the other direction. Now there is little or no understanding, and so we have maybe kids who are enthusiastic in the sense that they're seekers, but really this population that we struggle to reach would be this quadrant 4, because most of our ministry techniques, our ministry strategies really were born out of reaching quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 kids. And in order to reach kids in quadrant 4, we aren't going to be able to employ those strategies anymore. We'll talk more about that as we move into strategy and program for ministry. But I'm just going to go ahead and give you a little foreshadow about an emphasis in the class. So what are we left with? It's the unprecedented challenge of being an adolescent today. Adolescents today sense deep down that they're on their own and that they are reaching out, trying to grab hold of something that will communicate to them who they are, that will give them meaning. They're looking for something like a sacred canopy or a coherent grand narrative that makes sense out of their little story, or some kind of cultural exposure to Christianity. Does it exist out there? Does it explain for them what Christianity is? Is there spiritual capital available to invest in them to produce a return of being a self, or social capital that helps make sense for them what it means to be who they are? Well, those things have disappeared, and so now again they're on their own. This was really played out for me a few years ago when I asked a high school boy, Matt, who by all accounts had it all going for him. He was a senior in high school. He was a top academic student. He was a starter on the football team. But I said, Matt, where is it in your world day to day that tells you who you are? And he was quiet for a minute, and he said, well, I know I'm a person, but I'm not a somebody. I mean, he knew he was a person because he was just right there in that moment. He was taking up space. That's what he meant. But he didn't really know who he was. You've probably had similar kind of experiences too if you've worked with kids. So let's go back to where we began this whole thing here. Here's the church. Traditionally, not always, but traditionally youth ministry has kind of existed right over here. Some people have called that the one-eared Mickey Mouse. You may have heard that before. But I would say, and the reason I'm telling you all this about the self right now is that I feel absolutely convinced that in youth ministry we have to take seriously the challenges that adolescents face in becoming a self. It hasn't always been the focus of youth ministry. We haven't always thought it was our responsibility to help them understand what it meant to be who they were. So in my opinion, youth ministers are going to have to expand, or if I say you're going to have to expand your job description, that's going to make you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't add one more thing to my plate. So maybe what I want you to think is we have to redirect your role in this sense, that you have to be part of creating a mini sacred canopy that sustains not only what it means to be a self, but what it means for that self to trust in and grow into being a Christ follower. But see, if youth ministry just resides over here in this little segmented area, maybe you're already feeling the weight of that going, that as it exists right now can't create this mini sacred canopy. We can't pull that off. And my point is that's exactly right. So here's again what we need to be about. Youth ministry, again, needs to be this funnel that ushers kids into belonging in the larger church family. It's about adoption, so that adolescents encounter not just the resources of the youth ministry, but they encounter all that it means to exist as an individual within this larger body of others who are Christ followers, who have the spiritual and the social capital to help them navigate this challenge of adolescence, of becoming a self, so that they see themselves as adopted into the larger body of Christ and as belonging as heirs of this kingdom of God, this kingdom way of life, which is also something that we're going to talk more and more about. So there'll be a lot more that will come about exactly how we do this as we continue to explore these fundamental and foundational pieces that need to be in place to make that happen. So that's all coming, but this is just one of our foundations here, understanding the history of the self. So thanks for staying engaged all the way through to the end right here. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done it already, don't forget about the quiz on the HURT 2.0 e-reserve readings off to the right-hand side of the Moodle page, and your reading of that PDF document, A Brief History of Youth Ministry in the West. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you in week 3.